Hi, we're Oxygen Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. Welcome to the Shoot Room.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell people out there who you are and what you do?
I'm Selaine Saxby and I am the Member of Parliament for North Devon.
Exciting. Can you take us through your sort of short form life story, where you grew up, what your career looked like to how you end up being the MP?
So I am a daughter of teachers. My father was a head teacher. I was born in Coventry, moved with Dad's career, so spent some time in Essex, eventually ended up down on the south coast where my parents still are. And from there, I went on to Cambridge, where I read maths and management studies. From there, I moved into the city, worked in strategy consulting. From there, moved out to client side and worked in marketing. I then got married and moved to the States. My ex-husband worked in oil, and so moved to Houston in Texas, where I spent a lot of time playing tennis and improving my swimming, and competed in triathlons. And by the time I came home, I was a fully qualified fitness instructor. Actually, I qualified before I went. I'd hoped to be able to teach out there, but the visa I was on meant I couldn't work whilst I was in the States. So, but by the time I came back, I'd picked up a lot of entrepreneurial zeal, shall we say, whilst I was in the States. So I came back and did a patchwork quilt of jobs, but set up my own company during that time. I ran lessbounce.com, which was a sports bra business, which alongside I also taught fitness classes, and that gradually took off. And at some point during that journey, once I'd moved the business to the depths of Wiltshire, I started to tinker around the edge of politics when the gentleman next door but one to my office announced he was standing for the parish council. It was in a little village, and long before UKIP was a thing, we had a UKIP candidate in the village. I went to a drinks party, as you do, to sort of support his campaign. I left running the campaign. I'm still not quite sure how that happened. From that point onwards, a now minister actually turned up to help on the campaign. They themselves wasn't an MP either. And we went out together, and he just looked at me and he said, "You need to get yourself on the candidates list." And I was like, I hadn't even joined the party at that point in time. I wasn't really involved in politics, but it was the start of a journey that I haven't really looked back on, but that's way back 2007, 2008. So it was a long while before I was successful. So alongside politics, I fought 2015. I worked on a campaign in 2010. I worked for an MP between 15 and 17. But alongside that, I actually had to earn some money. And hence, when my business folded, I moved into politics full time. And again, then moved down here when everything folded. I lost my job in politics when my MP lost his seat, and moved down to Devon to just basically restart my life. And while I was here, then ended up retraining to teach maths. I did my training down in Exeter University, which was fabulous, and I was just in my NQT year when the then MP, who I was helping with their campaign back in October 2019, I had a car full of his leaflets, stood down, I picked up my phone at break time and went, "Oh, I wonder if that's why I'm here." So I'd actually taken myself off the candidates list. I decided that my political journey wasn't going to come to fruition. I wasn't going to get a seat, and that I was going to retrain and join the family firm and teach. And it was completely unplanned. And I had to basically renegotiate myself back onto the candidates list. So I was a candidate for a whole 6 weeks in 2019 before I was elected. So it was something of a whistle-stop tour, and it certainly wasn't what I planned. It wasn't why I came here, and I had, the whole thing has been a little bit, I'm somebody who would take an opportunity and leap, and that's, has been sort of my life ethos, is to give it a go.
That is the single best opening monologue we've ever had, full stop. Wow, I think we could do a week of questions on this, never mind. Okay, so the first thing I want to grab at is, why on earth, when you had that first conversation about a parish council, did it appeal to you, the idea of politics? Had you thought about it before that? And when that sort of proposition, when you said you should be on the candidates, what did that make you feel and think?
I think I've always been somebody who wanted to make a difference. And so I was, I'd have been on a school council, I'd have got involved, I ran campaigns I remember painting the common room at sixth form college. I would always be the person that sort of stood up and said something. I grew up opposite an MP, so I think when people talk to me about my background, many people say, "I bet that's how you ended up doing that." I lived opposite Ian Gow, who was murdered by the IRA. I was at home when he was killed. And so I think most people will say that's probably that whole change in your life. I was only 19 when Ian was murdered. that whole episode and living around that. And so I'd written to Ian as a little girl. I used to write him letters about people putting up signs. I hated people putting signs on telegraph poles because it left paper on the floor. And I remember as a very small, and he would always write back, which I always felt was very lovely. So I think I had a very different relationship with a member of Parliament because he was a neighbour as well as actually being Margaret Thatcher's private secretary. That I think that really did change probably my perspective on politics, and therefore when somebody said they were fighting to save the doctor's surgery in the village, it's like, well, of course I'll join the fight to save the doctor's surgery.
Because it humanised it, it made it real for you, knowing that connection?
I think the connection with Ian, I think there it was, because it was, I never really thought about it. It was just my childhood. They were in the village, they were neighbours, I played with his children. I think it's only when I got to Westminster and people sort of said, oh, I bet in your past that there was that sort of slightly different relationship. I think the same as my father being a head teacher changes your relationship with teaching. That
proximity, awareness, understanding the reality.
That you see the sort of relationship between power, between politics, between education, it just slightly changes your perspective by being close to it at a very young age. But actually getting involved when I did, I think that whole... because it was a local campaign, because it was relevant to where you live and your community, and that's always been, for me, that's what I see my job as here, is representing my community and doing the absolute best for those people. So I'll fight for every little bit.
And in that context, what does community mean to you?
I mean, here, North Devon is an enormous community. So it's got lots, I see it as one big community because that's what I have to go for. But it's got, I think we're 93 villages, 3 or 4 towns. So each bit's got its own community. And even within Barnstaple, which is the biggest town, there are definite communities within Barnstaple, be that a faith community, be it a voluntary community, be it your health community. So I see it at lots and lots of different levels, which is why I'll quite happily fight to fill in a pothole right through to making sure that the chemist doesn't close, or getting you a new GP, or trying to find out why we haven't got any dentists. So for me, it's about listening to what people are saying and what you're seeing and going, actually, how could we do this better, or how we could support this community to move forward and not lose a service, or to gain a service that perhaps didn't know that they wanted or needed.
So you're following that conversation about how you should be on the candidates list, and give us a little bit more detail about your journey from that first thinking about politics. So you said you engaged for a while and then thought your journey was over before actually finding that opportunity. So I got on the list probably 2009, just as we were heading into the expenses scandal. I wasn't successful the first time. You do what's called a parliamentary assessment board. Did you know you always had the natural leaning to the Conservatives, and that was...
As a younger woman, no, definitely not. My father and my mother are actually both quite left-wing, and I think for me it was very much as the business grew and the time in the States and that sort of entrepreneurial step up, giving people wings so they can fly, is really why I'm a Conservative. And so, but by the time it was suggested I'd stand, I was fairly deeply entrenched in this is where I live within the political spectrum.
One of my favourite stories in a similar vein is early in my career I was speaking at an environmental event, came off stage, and within 10 minutes had a member of the Labour Party and a member of the Conservative Party say, would you consider being a candidate? I don't know what I said that made the exact right appeal to both sides of that debate, but that sort of the entrepreneurial, the taking responsibility for your own actions and flying has certainly been something I've resonated more as I've got older.
Yeah, I think it is something that you almost grow into, but I'm definitely a greeny-blue Conservative. I would probably say I was an environmentalist long before I was a Conservative. But the actual political journey, what I did eventually I didn't get through my first parliamentary assessment board.
Could you describe that to people, what that looks or feels like, what's involved in there?
I believe they've changed quite a lot since I did mine, but it's very much like an interview panel, a recruitment panel, where they see if you've got the skills that you actually need to become a member of Parliament. And at that point in time, it was before David Cameron opened up the list to really encourage people that weren't politicians, and my feedback was that I wasn't political enough. And when Cameron opened up the list, my local MP at the time picked up the phone and said, I've spoken to him, we'll see you again. Because I was never a politician, I was running a business. But I describe my time on the list as a really great journey. I met some fascinating people. I learned a huge amount. And
does being on the list afford you the opportunity to meet a wider range of people and learning opportunities? Definitely. And you get to fight a campaign. In 2010, I was a campaign manager in Chippenham, worked with Wilfred Emmanuel Jones, and it was a very difficult campaign, and he lost.
Then in 2015, I stood in Llanelli. I was part of the team that won Gower by 26 votes after 109 years of Labour rule, which was quite a sweet moment. But when you win a general election by 26 votes, you learn an awful lot on that journey. But at the same time, I was still helping in Chippenham and also helping in Bath.
What's the one that sticks there? So as you said, you learn a lot. There was definitely something that came to mind. What were some of those big learnings from that?
The importance of every vote. That genuinely every single vote counts. And during that campaign on the day of the election, we were out knocking up the pledges, so people who said they're going to vote for you. And one of my team had knocked on a door of a lady and she said, "Oh, I haven't been able to get to polling." He said, "I'll take you now." She said, "Oh, is it that close?" He said, "It is going to be quite close." And so he said, "I'll bring you back cake tomorrow if it was your vote." And he went back with cake the next day. And this lady looked at him and said, "It wasn't that close, was it?" He said, "It was 26 and you were one of them." And I think it is that appreciating that every door that you knock on when you have a very, very tight competition really does make a difference, and the importance of those conversations and recognising every single individual voter, because I think people often feel their vote doesn't count, and therefore when you are in an election when it's that tight, suddenly you realise how much each one counts, and that actually you as a voter as well as a campaigner can actually make a real difference.
Brilliant. Okay, keep taking us through.
Where did I get? So that was 15, and then obviously 15 was a good night, and I picked up the phone to the Bath candidate I've been helping, and I knew my business was not in the best position, and had thoroughly enjoyed working on the campaign, and said, "Any chance you need some staff?" So I started with him part-time, and again, you learn so much. I think with politics, the pace is so fast. And
it sounds like that constant learning is important for you.
Yes, I think when you come from a family of teachers, I almost grew up in school and I've never really left. But that constant change.
My wife had the exact same upbringing.
It is that need to understand and understand your environment. And with politics, that is obviously constantly changing. And I think that period 15 through 17, when we had obviously the Brexit vote, was a very, very turbulent period. And I think it's easy, given all the turbulence we've just had, you kind of forget what we actually were doing in 2019, which was trying to unpick a whole load of turbulence. And so then obviously Theresa called the election very, very rapidly. And that 8 weeks was incredibly traumatic. And my MP lost their seat, as did many MPs. Again, you start again. You rebuild your life again. And in politics, there is that constant uncertainty.
Why do you have that resilience that lets you do that?
I have absolutely no idea. My middle initial is R, and my friends say that is for resilience. But I'm not quite sure. I think it was instilled in me from quite an early age. I would think my father would resonate on that stubbornness and need to just keep going.
So I work quite a lot. You're an MP. Some of the team are laughing in the background of this. Obviously you do too in terms of the demand. I often get asked why, and I have no idea. I don't know why. It's just because it's there and I want to push on and I want to do more. So I think sometimes when people say they're not sure, I think it shows really good self-awareness that they genuinely don't know.
Yeah, it was never a plan to wake up in the morning, but I have had many occasions where my life does seem to have completely fallen apart and I have to start again and rebuild it again. You have to dig deep.
It sounds like that makes you more empathetic, though, to others who have challenging experiences and difficulties, because if everything's a dream, and we've had the most amazing candidates apply for roles that have Oxbridge first, not a single hiccup, and you ask about resilience and they're like, never had to have any. It's all just been, and then when you get that first knock or that first problem, how do you learn to cope with it? So I think life gives you lessons, right? If you
Yeah, and I think I probably learnt some earlier on than many, but they seem to have a slightly repetitive nature about them. But it's been interesting listening to some of the coverage of some of the recent events at Westminster about the type of personalities that politics attracts, and you are likely to be slightly more risk-taking to do a job that every 3 or 4 years you potentially are going to lose. So only a certain type of person is going to be in a position to do that.
Increasingly, most careers are like that. When you look now, lots of people do a job for, I think I saw a stat the other day that the average duration of a role is 2 years for a person. So people are perhaps it's not as definitive as someone literally voting for you. Then we could adopt those things. But okay, so I think we're up to 19 and Theresa May's election.
and Theresa May, that was 2017, and obviously that was a less positive election. And at that point in time, I decided I was really going to take a step back from politics. I couldn't instantly get a job. I just thought, actually, maybe this is...
And were you sad, happy, excited about that next step? Do you remember?
The run into the 2017 election, for me personally, my mother was terribly ill. It had been a very difficult campaign. It had just been a difficult few weeks. And I think it was such a ghastly. There's nothing worse. I watched that one at home. I was like, I'm not being an account, being interviewed on a television tonight. We knew it. Well, my instinct was it was bad, and it was not. But also, I think for me, I was working for the MP rather than being the MP, which is a different flavour of knock. Again, you have to look for the opportunities, and I was by myself at this point in time. I no longer had my business. I needed to make some money, so literally the next morning I went and delivered leaflets offering myself as a personal assistant around the village in which I lived, and within 2 weeks I was fully employed again. But for me, that was my immediate priority, is how am I going to pay the rent next week. So it's that need to survive before perhaps being a need to thrive. And it was during that period that I thought, actually, I'm ready for a real change. And that actually I grew up by the sea. I wanted to be back by the sea. And the move to Devon was all about being by the sea. I only applied for jobs by the sea. So when I moved down here, it was very much, I'm moving to the coast. So
we have a lot of the marketing team sat in the room and they're just beaming, smiling, because your story is a marketer's dream in terms of the connection to place. And look, so sorry, keep going. So you arrived back here?
Yeah, so I came back here, moved for a job that didn't really work out. And again, started looking around. I did go back into politics briefly, worked for an MP over in Wales with a view to moving over to Wales. I just thought, I can't move again. It's taken quite a lot out of me. And I had this overwhelming sense I should stay in North Devon. I instantly fell in love with the place. I was learning to surf. I'd taken up rowing. The reasons for coming and having been a fitness instructor all my life, I actually then was back teaching fitness in some of the local gyms. I then set up a Nordic walking business along the coast, which was just, marvellous when you realise you can't probably run anymore. But walking is a great, particularly with sticks, is marvellous. You can keep moving. And hence, I then spent some time really looking and talking to myself about what am I going to do? I am now by myself. I find myself in a beautiful part of the country, but not actually with a particularly sustainable job. Therefore, I have a great degree, which I've never probably properly used. And so I actually spent a lot of time, went down to the university, found out what courses were available. Did I want to be a lawyer? Did I want to do this? Went and found out about teaching. I remember just going, actually, I probably have always wanted to teach. I've taught fitness. It's not the same. But that actually having a maths degree when we have a shortage of maths teachers, maybe this is the time. And again, itself is a terrifying experience going back to university when everybody else is in their 20s and you're in your mid-40s.
What do you think allowed you to be honest with yourself about what you wanted and didn't want in life? Because I think often people find that really difficult. They're influenced by others' perspectives or views or perceived societal pressures, but you actually had that honest conversation with yourself, say, where am I happy? What do I... How did you come about that? Where do you think that clarity
came? Because I was by myself. I think, I don't have children. The dog didn't mind. But
is this Henry at the time as well?
It wasn't, no, then that was Georgie. Okay. My dogs have all been named the children I didn't have. So I think that does enable you to do more. I didn't have a significant other at home influencing those decisions. Therefore, you are able to really talk to yourself. My parents already lived quite a long way from me. So it's not like I was in the midst of caring for parents either, and my sister lives internationally. So therefore, I in many ways selfishly was able to just look after myself. I was going to label it a different way. I was going to label it, it feels like that first decision that was authentically yours, and choice that was yours to make. That's why I think it's so powerful. Possibly. You also have no choice when you're by yourself. All your decisions are yours. And I think having run my own business for a long time, which is also a very lonely thing to do, and it's a small company, you know the magnitude of the decisions that you take. And I think moving down here was one of them, but it was a great thing to have done. And then what do I do if I want to stay? How am I going to facilitate that?
So we step into teaching, and you said you were in your NQT year?
I was literally in my NQT year, so I'd only done half a term. And when the phone went, I did phone my then, he's still my office manager, and just said, are you on the list? Because you never really know who else is on the list unless you meet them at a do.
Interesting. Okay.
And I knew he worked so hard, and he was already working. And often you work for an MP like I had done. And I'm not somebody who wanted to tread on anyone's toes. It was like, obviously, if you were on the list, this is your time to shine. He's like, I don't want to be an MP. I was like, okay. He said, but I'm pleased you phoned. He said, because somebody's already called to see if you do it. And again, so it was another journey that I hadn't expected to be on, but I went home and made some calls. And I remember somebody saying there's a marvellous organisation called Women to Win, which was set up by Theresa May and Baroness Jenkins, which is about supporting women to come into political life, to really try and encourage more women to become MPs. And I'd done so much with them. I was one of the early ladies involved in the whole project. And many of the women at that time are now cabinet ministers. And I phoned Baroness Jenkins, and I said, Anne, and I've got this opportunity. She said, Selaine, I think we've left this too late. I was like, Anne, I think we both know. And I still to this day have no idea what went on, because I never really heard much back from Anne. I just pressed on and applied as if I was on the list. So I was always told I'd be welcome back. So a friend sent me the form, because it was a new form, and I just filled in the form and applied as if I was allowed to. And
there's a lesson in life there, right? Get a firm no. Like, absolutely.
So just, applied. And then we have a selection procedure, the same as you always do, 3 of us in a room. And again, I think it was, nobody knew this time. So whereas previously when I've been on the list, there's a lot of pressure, to get you a seat, particularly where they're trying to get more women involved. Whereas this time around, the only person that knew, I think, was my sister. And she's out the country. Nobody else knew at all. And so I just
going
popped
into
off
that
to do it.
Process. How did you prepare for that? So going in there, how do you sort of think about that process?
I think, again, as I've said to at least one of the other ladies that was against me that night, I had done that for 10 years. So I'd been rejected by a large number of other seats before I got selected in Llanelli. I hadn't been successful in 17 in finding a seat. So I had been through the process. I knew what to expect. I also recall my very first selection and how utterly terrified I was then, whereas one, the pressure was off because nobody knew I was there and nobody knew I was even doing it, so there was no expectation. But 2, I had been able to call on some of the people that had helped me in the past, and some of those women linked to Women to Win, and practice the speech that I knew I had to give, and have enough time to write it and rewrite it. And having watched, because when you're not successful, somebody else was, but having watched other people be successful in those selection environments, to look back on what I'd learned during that process and what actually makes a speech that, to the people in that room, particularly at that point in time, we're 6 weeks from an election, most of them had never met me. How do you persuade them that you are the person that can step up to this job? That they thought they knew who was going to do it. So they were already in disarray. They thought they'd printed all the leaflets. They weren't expecting this change. So how do you persuade those people in the room? So I think having had the experience helps an awful lot to know what's going to happen next. So this is the speech that you'll then be asked lots of questions. You'll be in a green room. Nobody will talk to you. They'll take your phone away from you. All those things that the first time through, I think, is always terrifying. But I was very fortunate to have had a lot of background, and also to know, very fortunately, if it went wrong, I still had a job in the morning.
I don't think people for a second consider that MPs would be under that level of sort of personal pressure. I think they just assume every MP comes from a very wealthy background who's walking into a huge business, whether they walk out the door tomorrow or not. I think the sort of level of media coverage and sort of political discourse has totally separated the personality from the role, and I just don't think that's fair.
It's become, I think, a very, very, particularly in the last few years, I think in the time I've been up there, and I've said to other people in the media this week, I'm finding it increasingly hard to recommend it to other people to do, which I hate to say. Because I've always been somebody who's really advocated putting yourself forward and doing it. But I do, my intake in particular was a very diverse intake, and again because it was in many ways an unexpected election, therefore, and the swing was much bigger than planned. There were people who were elected who never expected.
There must have felt like a lot of momentum and excitement around it for that one.
Yeah.
Very different to the previous.
Very different to the previous one. And obviously for me, it was such a short campaign. I was selected on November the 11th and elected 5 weeks later. So there wasn't, and I was still teaching. I marked maths papers the night of the election in the hotel room. I marked my year 9 tests, much to the entertainment of everyone. And I then went back, having had 2 hours sleep, and taught a lesson that final morning before properly handing in my notice. And I still feel dreadful for the youngsters that I left behind, and a former maths teacher who knew I was agonising over was I going to do it, having committed to teaching and committed to all these children, and having said I wouldn't walk out the door because he just stuck his head around the door and said, "You'll be able to help many more young people."
You still feel the weight of that decision though, don't you?
Yeah, very much so. I think because I knew, training to teach, that you can't just walk out. When you're a candidate, they suddenly go, right, we're having a by-election in Blackpool, we'll see you all next week, or the general election's next week, we're all going, off you go, or you're selected to stand. Like when I was in Llanelli, the joy of running your own company is I can pack my bags and take my laptop to Llanelli and leave my team in charge.
You can't take the class.
But you can't, no. And that's why I'd taken myself off the candidates list when I trained to teach, because I felt the two were completely incompatible.
I'm fascinated to know, when you know you're going to be selected and you're ready to go with a campaign, what was your experience like? What does that 6 weeks look and feel like of campaigning?
I think on that particular occasion, the campaign was so far already underway. It was a single issue election in a way that the next one won't be. And you're a candidate, not a member of parliament, which I think also changes it. And I very much felt I was a passenger, that it was sort of already determined what was going to happen.
And you made the choice to go, well, this is the campaign, I'm running with it. There's not enough room to influence it in my own sort of vision.
I think given the time, and also that I was still teaching maths 40% timetable at the same time as the campaign, and obviously for anyone that remembers 2019, it did rain a lot, and the thing about a winter election is it's quite a tight, people don't want to see you once it's dark, so it was quite a different campaign. So we did a lot of politics in the pub, we did a lot of going to the pubs of an evening and at the weekend, and that very much was a personal choice. I've always been a big fan of the pub, but I do also recognise in rural life it's such a huge part of the communities.
So you walk into the pub to do that. Are you literally happening upon people at a table and saying, do you want a conversation? Or are you taking a spot and inviting the conversation in? What does delivering that look like politically?
It was, again, I was a new candidate. I was a little unsure exactly what we were doing altogether, but it was more about popping in and being there. So fine, some people we spoke to, actually it was often the guys behind the bar, beer prices, VAT, some of the issues that we still campaign on, and keeping alcohol duty down. Some of when people realise who you were, it's like, oh, actually this is a really big issue. Sometimes people are just like, oh, okay, if you have to sit in our pub, that's fine. And then other people, there was one pub I walked into and they're like, hooray, you've come, we've been following you on Twitter, we wondered when you'd get to ours. And you're like, oh really, oh that's nice. And we had no idea. We'd actually arranged to meet somebody else there. I think we did 43 pubs or something over the course of the campaign.
That is a heck of a pub crawl, isn't it?
It is, particularly as I didn't have a spot to drink in any of them. So that's a lot of non-alcoholic beverages. But it's part of our communities up here. And it's for me, it was like, how do you find people in an environment where they may wish to talk? I'm not insisting they talk to me, but I don't want to be knocking on their doorstep on a cold, wet night when you don't really want to be opening the door. So it was, how do I get out and meet as many people as possible and get to all the different parts of this wonderful constituency?
Amazing. So take us to election night when the result comes in, and what does that feel like, and what was your immediate thought?
So my friend who'd been my agent in Llanelli came over from Wales to be with me on election night. So your team goes to the count, the boxes at 10 o'clock when polling closes. We'd got to the hotel, again, because it was dark. In a summer election, you can knock on the doors right up till almost 10 o'clock. But in this one, we'd stopped much earlier. We made some phone calls through till about 8:30 and felt that was the right time to stop for the evening. So the team goes off to the count. We didn't. We had dinner and I marked my maths papers. We watched the 10 o'clock exit poll, which obviously is when you start to get a flavour of what is going to happen next. The exit poll is so accurate that you really get a sense of what's happening next. And normally you wouldn't get a result till quite late out here And David called from the count and said, and my heart just sank because it was so early. I was like, why are you phoning? What's gone wrong? He's like, no, I think you've won. We felt we were clear enough we could tell you from what we can see here already, so that you can talk to the team, because the last thing you want, I remember the count in 2010 when we did lose, people are sending messages back to the candidate who sat somewhere in a hotel room with friends or parents and going, oh, this box was really bad, and you don't want that. You have to just switch off as a candidate and just go, actually, somebody else is taking care of this.
Yeah.
Nationally, this looks good. This is probably going to be okay. But you don't know until the numbers come through. And so Bethany and I then headed over it was quite late. I think I actually didn't come in till 4, even though we'd known for some time. But you'll probably enjoy this story. So after we'd done the announcement, and I was still quite shocked by it all. I think it's still a bit of a roller coaster, and that we popped. Bethany, I didn't bring a bottle with me, she said, because I didn't want to tempt fate. So we went to the 24-hour Tesco and bought a bottle of fizz at 4 o'clock in the morning, and her card didn't go through on paying on the way out. So we just wandered out chatting and got stopped by security to go back and get it paid for again. It was like, it's a great start to political life. And then the lovely night porter got us a bucket of ice, and we watched the rest of the results come through on the telly until about 6. So that was my election night. Went back and taught my lesson. And very bizarrely, so when I was elected to council in similar circumstances here, actually, a very short notice campaign, and my parents had booked to come that weekend, and they didn't even know I was standing for council when they came. And I picked them up from the train station, had to tell them I'd been elected that morning, and they were coming this evening as well. So they kept saying, do you think we should not come? I said, no, it'll be fine. It's a good omen. So my parents sort of then got off a train in Exeter in the middle of this chaos. And whilst I'm busy trying to work out how I'm going to be in Westminster for 9 o'clock on Monday morning, my elderly parents arrived, and we went back to one of those pubs.
That's magical. So when you go from being candidate to MP, do they teach you what to do? What's the induction? So if you had a new member of staff on a team, you have an induction process that hopefully sets them up to be fantastic. Who teaches you stuff? Do they? Or do you just have to find your way of how it actually all works?
So I think, having worked for an MP, there was a certain amount I knew, but
that experience and knowledge that you were carrying.
But that was very much from the constituency end rather than the parliamentary end. And Parliament obviously has its own quirks. And then some of my colleagues seem to know the Parliament end inside out. Some people have worked for an MP up there. A lot of them have been special advisors, so they know their way around the parliamentary end. But
that was their apprenticeship.
So people come with very different knowledge bases. It's quite different to perhaps many other new jobs. We had this very intensive week's induction where I still have very hazy memories of exactly what happened. I know the Prime Minister spoke to us in a tent. It was just one of those weeks of, you will come here, you will have your photograph taken there, here is your computer, you're staying here. It was very, very surreal sort of week. And as I've said to people when they ask about how did that process go, it was probably too much information in too short a period of time. And obviously it was very close to Christmas. We'd had this very intense campaign, and we were doing the Brexit vote before Christmas. So you've also got overlaid on that this parliamentary process that the country's been watching for 2-3 years unfold, desperate for it to end. So we had that running in the background. And obviously our time in Westminster was very surreal. We spent the first few weeks getting Brexit done. Then we went home to get Christmas done. I actually went to Singapore, pre-booked the tickets to see my sister a long time before I was going to be elected. And over there in Singapore, they were already starting to get talk of this virus, because obviously being on the other side of the world. And obviously 8 weeks later, we were in lockdown. And so we came back, having got Brexit done, just starting to learn the ropes in Westminster, to suddenly be dealing with the pandemic, which we now all know what happened, but obviously we moved into that as a period of complete uncertainty and not knowing. So that journey of learning the ropes at Westminster, I think, I know more about doing politics in my PJs than many of the people who've been there for 50 years do. But it's taken, I think, much longer to get to grips with some of the parliamentary processes and the nuances, because so much of it we did on Zoom at home that we didn't really get the chance to have the parliamentary life that we all thought we were going up to experience.
It just adds to the tapestry of resilience you've had to display, because you think you're going to Westminster. Oh wait, no, we're back in the PJs. We're back in the
It was, yeah.
When you look back over the sort of COVID period, what are the sort of overriding memories of your experience of being in government during that time?
I think the fear out here of the virus.
Within the constituency?
Yeah, the fear back here, because we obviously saw a lot of people moving back down to second homes out to be somewhere nice rather than being locked down in London, if you could fear that was coming. And that real people not wanting visitors to come here. And so normally, as an area that prides itself on its tourism economy, to have everyone going, we don't want them to come. And I think it was the utter terror around not knowing what the virus could do or would do. And we obviously had worked out fairly early on it potentially did an impact on older people. And obviously we are an older community up here. And we are also home to the smallest and most remote hospital on the UK mainland. And I think that sort of terror around what would that mean? It's not going to take much for this hospital to struggle. And in fairness, they were absolutely marvellous. But that fear, and I remember as we came back, having run a business myself with sort of 100,000 customers, a very busy inbox, and that's what it was like. Suddenly we all just went on to customer service duty. It was just a constant string of people. Can I do this? Am I allowed to do this? I'm scared of doing this. Why is this allowed to happen? This is my views on it. And people just a lot of the time wanted reassurance, which you couldn't always give. And I think my overriding memory of government at that time was of people desperately trying to do the right thing. I wasn't a minister, I'm not involved in cabinet, but Penny Mordaunt made herself available in the cabinet office every morning. She held a call that all parties could dial into with if you had issues around whatever it was. Week after week, I'd phone in and talk to Penny at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you could just submit your questions so that issues that you had in your constituency, you could get back into government to get answers. And they varied very much around the country, but our sense was we were trying to help. But that's very much how I felt. It was, and people were desperate to do something and to help and be useful. And it's a period that's very hard to reflect on because it was such a whirlwind. And then suddenly, once we were locked down, again, it still to this day surprises me that Boris did it. I remember sitting in my office with a colleague in a very socially distanced manner with 2 windows open, just watching this and go, really? I guess we're going home tomorrow then. And it was so uncertain. But I do feel to this day that people really tried to do the right thing. I think when you look back on it in hindsight, it probably looks different, but people were learning.
I think it's so unfair to do that because you can't apply the nuance and the complexity of the environment as decisions were made then 4 years after the fact, looking back and go, well, we would have done this then. It's not the same. No. I think it's so difficult and unfair to do that, yet we always tend to. I could ask you 50 million questions about the reality of this stuff, but I want to get us back to local and your 6-point plan for Devon.
Yes.
Can we explore that a little?
Yeah, so when getting Brexit done up here was obviously top of everyone's list, but getting broadband done was the next most important thing that came up on the doorstep.
And how did you, on the doorstep, that's how you knew that was the
yeah. Okay. Well, and obviously, so my campaign manager, David, who had been my predecessor's office manager and is now mine, knew that this had been a huge issue in Peter's inbox. I'd lived here. I didn't need telling. It was a huge issue that our connectivity was quite poor. And so that was something that I very much knew was going to be something I was going to work on the second I got to Westminster. Many of the other points in the plan I'd say were probably a little bit more generic around supporting the environment, supporting our farmers, skills for the next generation. But it was the broadband one that I felt potentially I could actually make a difference with. And I had the opportunity very early on at Westminster to stand up to become the chairman of the All Party Parliamentary Group on broadband and digital communications, which I just leapt into. And again, my second letter when I got to Westminster, my first one was on dentists, my second one was on broadband. And Clive Seeley, who's the chief exec of Openreach, they have big events at Westminster when they'd have a big one on broadband and connectivity, and Openreach were running this, and he was there, and they'd sent us a letter saying they'd done all these great things on our patch. And I was like, listen, I went down and found him, and he said, oh, Selaine, we're doing all this stuff in your constituency. I said, no, none of these things are in your constituency. He said, well, I obviously don't know where it is. I said, no, that is the problem. And so in fairness to him, he appeared in my office 10 days later and came up and asked if there was a big rural project that he could do. He said, look, I hear what you're saying. I've had a look at the data now. I can see you really do have an issue here. There'd been a big problem with connecting Devon and Somerset and the contract procurement many years previously, which had meant as an area we were a long way behind. And he did. That relationship enabled Linton and Lynmouth to be connected as we headed into the pandemic. There is fibre down the funicular railway in Linton, but he also came up and they connected a couple of primary schools during the pandemic as well, where we found that we suddenly had schools going, actually, we don't have any broadband. How are we going to deliver this? And so, yeah, it was a building a personal relationship, but again, taking the issue from here. There's still more to do, but it is an area that there has been a dramatic improvement. And it's something that if I read my inbox, I very rarely now get contacted about broadband issues, whereas certainly pre-pandemic, it was a very, very big concern.
Quick question on inbox on the way past. What sort of inflow of correspondence do you receive on a weekly basis? Do you know?
I would say we're between 500 and 1,000 emails from constituents. That's probably at the top end. It's been quieter over recess. During the pandemic, that was at least double.
So in terms of processing that, how many of those will you see personally of the 1,000?
It depends a little bit on what time of day they come in. So obviously I'm fortunate to have a team that are helping with that correspondence. And we also have, there is an element of repetition within that. So some of the things that are specific cases, or if, say, a school wrote in, or if the hospital writes in, those sort of things would always come past me. If it was more of an individual issue, a pothole, for example, I may not have seen the correspondence, but we also analyse the content. So somebody will go, actually, you've had 50 emails this week on potholes. You've had 40 on puppies, whatever is the topical issue at that time. So there is, it's reading the inbox, and I had done it for an MP, so I felt I had some experience in understanding this. It's about being able to try your best, and you can't always fix everything, to respond to those bits of casework. So things like government organisations coming out of the pandemic, driving licence renewals was one of the things that, obviously when you get to 70, you need to renew your driving licence, but we had COVID restrictions still in place in Wales, so people couldn't get their driving licence renewed. And so my team, one of them has actually developed a personal relationship with the driving licence, because we had so many people in this position, but you're able to almost build that skill set in so that actually this one we can help. But government bodies is often where we can nudge things along, but it doesn't always need me, that there are processes in place and that there are helplines that my team can access, often much quicker than waiting for me to have time to read the email.
So I remember you saying early on that living across the road from the MP, he would always reply to the letters. So when you first started, was it important that it was you that always replied and you had to learn to let the team step up, or straight away you knew the correspondence was just so much we need a process for doing?
I have hand signed, I believe, approaching 30,000 letters since I've been elected. And I read all of those before they go. So we write, and I prefer to write because I think it gives people a proper document from their MP, and it also gives them time to digest the response, because I think it's very easy in email terms to instantly, particularly if it's not the response you want, to fire back. And I'm not sure that that's always helpful for anyone involved in the chain. But then those that are what I would call a campaign email, so where we may have had 300 emails on this subject, those ones we post the responses on the website, unless it's something that we know specifically is very local, or we've been able to make a real difference. There's been the odd one which we've had a real success with, that we've been able to go, actually, you all wrote to me about this and this has actually now happened. It's good news to share, but we try and keep those up on the website so that if we have many people, my bounce back email would tell you that. So it says, if this was a campaign email, you will find the response on this page.
The nature of the question is, so I try and reply to every email personally still, but we're at the point whereby it's getting increasingly difficult, and I find not doing that challenging, so it's me looking for tips of how best to balance that.
So what I did when I ran my business, which is, again, it was a .com, so we had a lot of incoming emails, and we did the same as I'd done with the business at the start of the pandemic, was to actually train a team to respond to the types of emails. So we actually had standardized responses that I had written, and what we were able to find quite rapidly is that there are some things that come in and they're the same and they don't need you, and if you've got a well-trained team, then there's other things that do need you, and it's that initial filter from being able to say, actually, these ones, and it's for us, I think in politics, particularly where we've got the opportunity to help people, that I would hate anyone. I always look at it as an advantage that my team will take care of this. So there was one this morning.
The speed really helps, right?
Yeah, one this morning, by the time I'd actually opened my computer, one of my team's like, I've already actioned this so that this is with so-and-so. So it's that actually we can try and get things moving. And quite often when people phone and say they want to see me, my team will be like, what do you want to see her about? Because we might be able to fix this. She's very happy to see you, but actually, oh yeah, I've got this issue with the hospital, whatever. Okay, well, we can do that now. Oh, okay, that's great. And I think it's, for me, it's looking at the outcome. Whilst I find it quite difficult to let go, is that actually people have contacted me because they want something to be done. Therefore, if somebody can do that quicker and better before I actually read it, I would rather that was being progressed.
I totally agree. Second and third things on your list you mentioned were the environment and farming. Such a challenging place for farmers at the moment, and so much terrible news and statistics around the state of the environment, climate and biodiversity. Today's probably the first sun we've seen here in 4 months. How can farming and a better environment coexist?
As I said in my maiden speech, farmers are the custodians of the countryside, and I think they know better actually than almost anyone else what you can do around the edge of a farm to bring life in. Because if your soil isn't well, fertilizer isn't working well, if your soil's running off down the road, it's not doing the job it's supposed to do as soil. And farmers know all of those things. And I think it's giving them the power to really look after their environment. And I think what we've been able to do post-Brexit is to facilitate some of those decisions for farmers so that they are rewarded for some of that work that they do to support the countryside. I think it's getting that balance, and I think Ukraine has really shown the need to put food security much higher up, perhaps the agenda than it had been. And I think there's a real change that we're seeing, and it's definitely been Ukraine that triggered that, to go, actually, how do we ensure that we enable our farmers to farm as well as support the countryside at the same time? And I think a lot of the schemes we've put in place, it's very interesting that you'll perhaps hear a lot of negative coverage, but when you actually go and stand on a farm with a farmer who's just spent Christmas holidays with their children putting in the hedgerow that you're looking at, and I got paid to do this, he'll busy saying, and I put all of these trees, I put extra trees in the middle of the hedge, and suddenly you've got biodiversity gain. They've been rewarded for it, but they've still got their crops and their sheep either side of it, and looking at some of the ways that the crops are being adapted so that you're having some of the fields in the middle of the drought the year before last. That one's very green. Oh yes, well that's my clover mix, and that one retains water better, and that's why that field stayed green. So some of the things that they've been able to do, increasing the biodiversity, is also more drought resilient and provides a long-term feed for the particularly sheep, but also your cows. So I think it is a really difficult balance, but I do also think farmers are very well placed, and I do a lot of work with the NFU, Country Landowners Association, and all those bodies to try and understand and aggregate it up. And being on the EFRA Select Committee now as well, have a real opportunity to sort of influence and listen in that space as to how do we do that, because actually food security is important and we can grow more here than we do. Therefore, let's facilitate those people to do it. I think the piece that we're missing, that I'm very frustrated that we don't have, one of the pressures that our farmers are under, is obviously we also have an energy security issue, and things like solar panels on fields. How do we optimise our energy at the same time as our food security? And I think we are behind on producing a land use strategy. The Secretary of State did say it is imminent, so I'm hoping that means we're nearly there. But how do we balance the two, so that we are able to look at net zero, which is also coming at us, but similarly we need to eat on the journey to that? And how do we balance how we use what is an island? We can't do everything.
So if we go back to the water environment to start with, and you mentioned the soil running off fields.
Yeah.
So we see that a lot around our travels, and some of the things you mentioned about cover crops and different types of arable choices will certainly help with that. Do you think the mechanisms that are in place are what we need, and ultimately it's just giving it time to embed in, which will improve things? Or do you think there are other additional interventions that government needs to make in terms of the way farmers are farming?
I think farmers are best placed to deliver, and the joy of having a farming minister who's a proper farmer is fantastic. To actually, when Mark's up here, to actually take him out to a farm and talk to people in their own language. I think there is always going to be more we can do, but I do think we need to really embed food security and how that works. And I think there's a real concern at this point in time with the weather. I was out with a massive dairy herd last week, and they still can't get out in the fields because it hasn't stopped raining, and that has implications on our milk prices. That has implications on feed, and it has implications on the animals' welfare. And I think we do have a real issue with how much rain's come down, and that is going to have a massive impact on our own harvest and our own animals. So there is obviously climate adaptation that needs to be built in to the farming environment, but also, as we were talking about earlier, the vineyard just down the road from here, there are other crops as the climate changes that we can take advantage of.
That is more advantageous for.
And it's that evolution rather than a revolution. But I think, farmers want to farm first and foremost, and we really need to be working towards better food security on here as an island, so we're not stuck with what happened when we had the start of Ukraine with grain prices jumping like they did.
So the two biggest challenges, I'd come back on the food security ones, which I'll be interested in your views on, are, and this is based on DEFRA research in the early 2020s. I'm not always the biggest proponent of DEFRA, so I appreciate that data might have some holes in, but it reported that 30% of the food produced in our fields never left the farm gate because it didn't meet the aesthetic standards that supermarkets wanted, or there wasn't the available resource to pick it. So that's one of the challenges. What do you think we can do about helping in that way?
I think we've obviously seen that there's been issues with picking crops, right the way through from daffodils through vegetables, and that with the best will in the world, we have relied on labour from overseas to come and do that. And I think we as a society need to look at ourselves in that. If we've got crops and we have people available to work who feel they can't do that job, and farmers feel the only way they can get their crops picked is for people to come in from outside the country, I think that's a bigger societal issue that I'd love to say I can fix. But the reality is, it is back-breaking work. Having been to the asparagus fields in Braunton, that's a tough job picking asparagus. And I think, therefore, how farms evolve to enable the crops to be picked is vital. With regards to wonky vegetables, I think there has been a real change in the country with regards to wonky vegetables and acceptance of what more can be done. And I'm a big proponent of supporting Fair Share, who do a lot of work too, where you've got crops that perhaps don't come out of at the end. They do things like, if you've got too many carrots, they'll come and pick up your carrots and make carrot soup. Is that how do you actually ensure that you're not sending food to waste? We have far too many families struggling with food, and the idea, and I think it would break a farmer's heart, they don't spend their lives growing crops to not have people
to see
eat
it
them.
go in the bin.
So I think that we as a society need to look at some of those bits where they do break down. Do our carrots have to be straight? Most of us don't mind.
And I suppose if you pull it forward, that's our fault for demanding them. The supermarkets would sell us a product we'd buy. So
I think, again, it's a mixed bag, and I think we have seen where some of these products have come through and you're like, actually you can have bent ones and they're cheaper. Price is a factor in many of these decisions, but I think we also have reached a point where our supermarkets have a lot of influence in the pricing of our food, and that's why I've been sort of this huge proponent of the Buy British campaign with Dr. Luke Evans, that actually getting people to understand and buy their food locally. We're very fortunate out here in North Devon. We have fantastic farmers, and we can see local produce and we can see where it's come from. Not every family has that opportunity, and not everybody has a farm at the end of their drive that they can go to a farm shop and pick up things that came out of the ground this morning. We're very, very lucky out here, and I think it is, how do we expand that education to people to really properly understand some of the food mart journeys and some of the costs, some of the things we eat that we think are sustainable, and some of the vegan foods, they've had huge amounts of water added, they're shipped halfway around the world, are far less sustainable than some of the foods that are actually produced right here on our doorstep. Can
you help people understand how important the hospitality industry is to North Devon?
It's the biggest part of our economy, without a shadow of a doubt. It employs thousands and thousands of people and generates a huge economic positive input locally, and I think it is absolutely fundamental. When I was first elected pre-pandemic, I was very keen on devising this whole, how do you make North Devon almost like an eco-tourism, link it into the biosphere? What more could we do to get people up here in a sustainable way, rather than all because let's be honest, most of us drive up here. How do we actually make some of the things that go on up here anyway? Because people do come up, the wild birds along the estuaries are just incredible. We have this amazing bird population. If you do go out to Lundy, with just remarkable wildlife that you can see. And there are so many, again, great stories within those sort of hidden treasures, and that we have with the moors, that diversity from, right through the beaches, that whatever you want to do on a holiday, if it involves leaving the house, we are the place to come and do it. I think we just have the most incredibly rich outdoor space here. And so how you can bring that to life.
You literally light up when you're talking about the environment.
Yeah, it's great. I walked the coastline last summer for the Year of the Coast. So I walked right the way down from the Somerset border back down to Instow. And it's just amazing what you see walking your coast. But one of the reasons I love being on the water is to be able to look back on the constituency, to actually see what's there, because you get such a different perspective once you've put water in that mix and understanding that interaction between the two. But really the biosphere does such great work up here, and that having their overshining sort of idea that you can live as one with the environment and enhance it at the same time.
How do we square that circle? So that sort of whole ecotourism thing is something that's really important to us here at Mornicott, which is the very nature of this estate. So we're recording this in April 24, and we're just in the process of renovating the farmhouse here. So this whole estate will be available for ecotourism and to really embrace rewilding and natural regeneration of things alongside the farming we have on site as well. How do we make sure we encourage people to visit, but the very act of doing that doesn't damage the environment? How do we balance that?
I think it is a really difficult balance, but I think it's also understanding some of the very basic things. I learned as a little girl, about not taking things away, leaving it as you found it. I obviously campaigned very hard last year to get disposable barbecues banned from public beaches.
It's so important for wildfires as well.
Yeah,
so often
there are so many complications around some of those things. Is there a better way of doing this? And obviously we had a huge fire out at Baggy Point where a barbecue lifted from the beach in the wind, and I think it is understanding the dynamic nature of here. We have such a monumental tide. It's the second biggest range in the world, and that in itself brings hidden treasures ashore, but also hidden nightmares with plastic pollution coming in from the sea. And so I spent quite a lot of time at Westminster working on some of those big projects, and we're working at the moment with an international body on plastic pollution and how to tackle it. And I think one of the ideas we've been exploring pre-pandemic, which we haven't really had a chance to pick up, is how can you embrace that as almost part of your holiday. And I think some things like the 2-minute beach clean, those things to actually, and Plastic Free North Devon do such a great job in this space, how you can actually come on holiday and be a part of that solution. So I actually quite like the idea of sending people out to plant trees, or actually over in Braunton they've done a huge amount of work with bees, and at the Ruder Holiday Park they've got a load of bats. They've got some of the rarest bats in the country, so everyone thinks of Croyd as being this incredible surf beach, but if you walk around with their range around the back, they've also done a load of work with sort of the cows and cow pats, and that encourages the different wildlife. And so there really is a huge amount going on behind those sand dunes, and sand dunes themselves. Up at Braunton we have the Water Jemandra. It's one of only 2 places in the country, so I went up with the rangers up there. There's so much going on that people don't necessarily know about, that I think you can really devise tours and things that you can come and do. But what I love about it here is you can almost do it yourself.
Yeah.
There aren't many places that you can go surfing and still find a seal goes past quicker than you did. Which is one of the joys of being up here.
One of the best things about Mornicott is a sort of going out on a wildlife safari with Charles, the estate manager here, just as the sun's setting, is magical. He's been here 15 years and he is as good as any trained ecologist you'll ever meet in terms of understanding the landscape and pointing things out. It is just
and
magical.
I think the dark sky over on Exmoor as well, if you haven't been able to experience that, it does give you a real insight as to why it's important when you design new developments that you don't put your lights on.
Yeah.
Actually sometimes you have to almost go and experience that, and I think coming up here, which is so remote and so special, and having that opportunity to see what it's like and why it's important.
I think it's the perfect balance of remote but accessible still. So when we invite guests and friends from London to come to the podcast, they're like, oh wow, it's really accessible on the train still to get down here. So some more guests we've got this afternoon are coming in from London. So I think it is a really nice balance of the place.
Yeah.
So my final topic of questions to ask you on is me asking some advice, actually. So the vast majority of the inflow we get from people talking about our work is overwhelmingly positive. People love the environment, want us to do more around conservation. But when you seek local people's opinions, wherever you are in the world geographically, so we're from the Highlands all the way down to Cornwall with quite a few sites in Devon, not everyone's opinion is the same. Mm-hmm. Some people want to do X, some people want to do Y. When you've been seeking opinion on the doorsteps or in the pub or in your PJs, whichever type of inflow is coming on the info, how do you reconcile those challenges? Because you want to represent a community, but they all have different views. How do you reconcile that?
I think it is incredibly difficult, and there are times when you literally have people at loggerheads over exactly the same issue, even when it's something like the environment that you think should be a dead cert and everyone in agreement, because people do care hugely about it. And I recognise that the vast majority of correspondence I get on environmental issues is because people care. But I think rewilding, for example, is one that's quite a controversial topic, and that actually, when we look at food security, that's not always entirely compatible with rewilding. Now, there is some regenerative farming that is basically rewilding in a sustainable manner, but there is also occasions where rewilding, we see farmers being pushed out. And whilst there might be significant biodiversity gain, is that the only way that you can achieve that biodiversity gain? So I think it's trying to work out what is the objective here, and is there a sustainable way that listens to food security, listens to energy security, you know, what are the things the country wants. And I think that has changed quite a lot from when I first came in. You know, Cameron was very much, you know, vote blue, grow green. And Boris, obviously, with his Big 10 Greenpoint plan, a lot of which we have actually quietly got on and delivered. But I think it's slightly dropped off people's focus because they have so many other things. You know, when you've been through the shocks that we have to the economy with Ukraine, that really does impact on people's perspective. And I think people will always care about the environment, but when you ask on the doorstep at the moment, it's not as high up.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be the key issue in this election at all. I think in the next it will, and the one after that it'll be even more, because the realities of climate change and biodiversity collapse will become more and more real every day. We'll look back on 2024 as this incredibly wet year, but even right now people aren't going, that's climate change. They're just going, it's been a wet start to the year. So I think three elections, when my children are voting, they're 5 and 7 now, I think it'll be far more of an issue than it is right now.
And I think one of the slight sadnesses with all the rest of the world news that's been going on is that last COP, actually we didn't hear as much about
didn't get the traction,
what happened. You know, and I had the opportunity to meet John Kerry, the US Senator up at Westminster, and to hear his views. And I think, you know, so much of the work we've done, there's this sort of slight sense that we've stepped back from net zero. But the reality is we're the first G7 country to have halved our emissions. But our emissions are dinky compared to the rest of the world. And talking to John Kerry, he felt that at the last COP, they really had started to make progress on international movement to tackle climate change, because with the best will in the world, whatever we do here is unfortunately not going to solve the problem. We can influence, we can lead people, but as a small island, our changes are not always going to be enough. So it's been quite an interesting journey to understand how do we get the pace right for net zero to do what we need to do, but at the same time be influencing people whose changes could make a huge difference on that journey, and to actually get that balance, as people have gone, actually, but I want food. You know, we don't want our food to be expensive. We'd like our local farmers. That there's been a real shift within, I think, people's perception actually around productive land and what productive land could look like, which is why for me this land use strategy and getting that balance for us as a society between, we are on a small island, how do we retain the essence of somewhere as beautiful as this at the same time as generating our own energy from renewable sources and growing food and making sure we've still got the biodiversity that we know actually sustains the others, because the more that we can put in. But a lot of that is now legislated for, which I think is a testament to some of the work that has gone on, although most people, the Environment Act's a very lengthy document that most people haven't been through.
That's accurate indeed. If we're sat here again in 5 years, what do you hope has changed in your constituency?
I hope they will have finished the link road. I hope that we will have found a better way to fix potholes. I say that slightly loosely, but that has now topped my inbox again for 4 months. And I hope...
I love that that's your answer, because there's no clearer way of showing that you're listening. Because that's not your particular. You haven't come in and go, do you know what? I just want to talk about potholes. That's the inflow of information you're getting from constituencies saying this is a big issue to us.
And I think it's how do we better understand rurality? A lot of the work that I've done at Westminster, and I led a debate on levelling up rural communities, is rural life is different. And it has different costs associated with it. And I
don't think that's recognised anywhere near enough how different it is.
And how do we make sure that the services that we deliver with an ageing population up here reflect that rurality? And I think sometimes the decisions that are taken in city centres, which impact our lives, don't reflect that enough. So I think it's constantly, for me, challenging some of those norms to see what more we can do. What I'd dearly love to see up here is that we have found a way to deliver affordable housing so young people can stay and live and work in the area, that in 5 years' time the new hospital is underway, that we have some floating offshore wind turbines drifting out into the Celtic Sea, and that some of the really high-paid, highly skilled jobs that go alongside those wind turbines are coming on shore, and that young people that are currently at school in North Devon are actually taking up those jobs, because at the moment far too many of the youngsters up here feel they can't afford to stay, and that the jobs that are available don't always suit them. But we have some really exciting companies up here with some really incredible contracts just being won at the moment, and so I really, as a former maths teacher myself, I just hope anyone watching is doing their maths homework and actually studying those STEM subjects, because the jobs of the future that are available here, you can stay here, you can surf, you can still go to the beach at the weekend, and you can earn really good money and have a job for life living where you grew up. I think there's some really exciting opportunities, but we have to fix our infrastructure, and we really need, in my mind, somebody. Unfortunately, I don't have the skill set, but anyone watching who would like to come and help, I'm very happy to make introductions that can look at our infrastructure and really plan that bit better for the population that we have, the population's age that we have, and to actually ensure that if we need to build more houses, and I know that's not what people want to do, and that's why I've been very supportive of changes to legislation around second homes and holiday lets, so that we start to use the housing stock we have more effectively, so we don't have to just keep building. But if we are going to build, that infrastructure comes around it, so that we're building communities, not just houses with other bits of stuff that doesn't work alongside it. So I think it is, how do we lift our communities up, and really, I think, build for the future, because I feel some of the time, particularly the potholes one, we jest about, but it's almost an annual issue with rain. It rains here, and that's going to happen every year. It's like, how could we find a slightly more sustainable long-term solution rather than just patching? What I'd really love is to find some longer-term solutions to really give that roadmap for the people of North Devon.
Wonderful answer. Thank you so much for coming in. It's been an absolute joy to have you in the shoot room. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.